Aditi, I think, well, let's begin start.
Hello again. Please excuse me for the background noise. Just can't help it. But thank you for joining us today. This session is titled Diversity and Representation in Economics, Report, Launch and Discussion. And this is brought to you by three set of organization collectives, namely Rethinking Economics India Network, Bahujan Economists, and Prayogshala. A quick introduction to these three organizations. So Rethinking Economics India Network, REIN, is the national network of global rethinking economics movement. It operates as a nationwide ecosystem of stakeholders in the space of pluralist and heterodox economics. It looks to interface with individuals, universities, civil societies, and the private sector in order to encourage teaching, learning, and discussion for scaling collaborative efforts towards better, more inclusive economics in India and continue towards the global movement at large. The Bahujan Economist is a platform for researchers, scholars, students, professors belonging to SC, ST, OBC, also called Bahujan, communities in economics to collaborate and support each other and for allies to extend support to us. Along with an attempt to increase our representation in academia, so the group's objective is also to put forward the perspective which has largely been missing from the discipline. The third organization, Prayogshala, comprises a team of researchers, authors, assistants, and interns. They currently work in the area of psychological and economic academic research. Their aim is to enhance the practicability of discipline we function in through the use of research software, research database, and research management tools to facilitate the research process. So this was a brief introduction to the organization who have worked together for the report, which will be launched in some time. And today's plenary session will comprise of report launch followed by discussion on under or misrepresentation of marginalized gender and caste groups within the discipline, highlighting the role of economists in making the ecosystem more accessible and inclusive. The report has been prepared by REIN in collaboration with Bahujan Economist and Prayogshala. So the report will be launched by Anirudh, Mihir, and Jasmine. And after the presentation, we will open the floor for discussion and for the same, we are joined by a panel of speakers who have engaged through their work on the questions of representation and diversity in academia. And the panelists are Dr. Deepak Malghan, who is Associate Professor of Public Policy at Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and is primarily recognized for his contribution to reformulating ecological economics from a scale perspective. His most recent work on the residential segregation of urban India throws light on the persistence of caste in India. Welcome, Professor Deepak. Our second speaker today is Dr. Nidhi Sabrawal, Associate Professor at Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, National Institute of Education Planning and Administration, and has previously worked as a Director of Indian Institute of Dalit Studies. She has conducted extensive research on the development concerns of the poor, especially scheduled caste group. Her current research focuses on access and equity in higher education. Welcome, ma'am. We are also joined, we have also Dr. Nishi Prakash, who is an Associate Professor of Economics on a joint position with Department of Economics and Human Rights Institute at the University of Connecticut. His primary research interests include development, political economy, economics of education, public policy, and behavioral economics. Throughout his academic pursuit, Dr. Prakash has focused on the relationship between government policies and economic development and harnessed rigorous empirical evidence to study the impact of policies and institutions in enabling inclusive growth. Welcome, Nishith. So the discussion will start with the opening remark from all of our speakers. Then we will have some time for each other's remark and pose questions. Speakers will have time to respond to each other's remark and pose questions. This will be followed by a public Q&A session where I'll be asking question posed by attendees. So please add your question to Q&A section and also upvote the question which has already been asked so that it makes it easier for me to choose the questions. So once again, welcome everyone. And I will invite Anirudh to take over now.
Thanks so much, Aditi, and we're really honored to be part of this this event and this report launch. I think if Mihir can start sharing his screen, then I will sort of just briefly run through the. Okay, good. Okay, so this report that we're about to sort of discuss very briefly is basically talking about diversity and representation in economics in India, and this is, as Aditi said, this is a joint sort of collaboration between Rethinking Economics India Network, Bahujan Economists, and myself at Prayogshala, and we have an extensive list of co-authors who contributed quite substantially to this report. And before I started, I would be remiss to not sort of thank them very much for all their efforts in putting this together. We've been working on this for about 2.5 months, so I think this is hopefully we'll sort of forward the conversation about diversity and representation through this report. Okay. So I'm going to briefly sort of introduce the report and also talk a little bit about context before handing over to Keith. So, economists are typically taught about ideas of efficiency and equity, but I think the reason that we're here today is to say a little bit briefly that those are actually very rare points of discussion within the domain of the profession itself, right? So there are two perhaps arguments that can be put forward. So one is that if you do not have diversity or adequate sort of representation of different voices in academia and economics, especially, then there's a problem of efficiency. That is, you have some misallocated resources to those who might have potentially made significant contributions to the field. And there are, of course, concerns of equity, right? So there are unfair opportunities, and perhaps you're, in a way, perpetuating inequalities that are already present in society. If you look at this sort of brief world map that we quickly put together, it sort of talks about female representation in economics around the world. This is data from Ideas Research Papers in Economics, REPEC, which has a very nice sort of tool that tells us about how many female authors are registered with REPEC as a share of total authors. So you can see that, even in the US, for example, there's a sort of low representation of female economists. And in fact, the representation of women in economics in academia is even lower than the STEM fields, so-called science, technology, engineering, and math. So representation becomes important not just for the sake of itself, but due to potentially far-reaching societal implications, right? So economics through policy provides one of the most important mechanisms for socioeconomic upliftment. Decision-making, for example, through policy and other spaces is also affected, and economists that are far disconnected from the people whose lives that they actually impact. So on the one hand, you have oppressed communities that have long been treated as passive subjects and subjects of the research that people work on, devoid of any agency really. And on the other, there's this absolute dearth of empirical data, and that's something that will come up later as we progress through the report as well. There's a dearth of empirical data or research on questions and issues that are actually of concern to these communities. So we know that economists typically serve two functions. They have sort of this, normative as well as this positive, approach to economics is what you could call it. So having a diverse set of voices is likely to be very important in improving plurality in not just in academia, but also in advisory bodies, in think tanks, in universities, research institutions, everywhere, right? So, and there have been studies in economics using lab experiments, using other sort of methodologies that even suggest that having diversity within groups is actually beneficial for solving complex problems, things like that, right? So the main question that we set out to answer with this policy brief is with special reference to female and caste representation. So the question we ask is, how well represented are women and members of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, other background classes, individuals in the Indian Academy of Economics? Right. So on the basis of work in other social sciences in India as well as in other countries, we provide some recommendations. Jasmine will talk about that a little bit in detail on diversifying the academy further. And we talk a little bit about the barriers to inclusivity in economics and how they can be overcome using this multiple stakeholder approach. Over to you, Mihir.
Thanks, AD, for giving us that introduction and kind of setting the context for why diversity and inclusivity is important, but not just in economics, but definitely throughout the academy. So let us now take a quick look at the story that the data is trying to paint for us. So at the outset, we see some very promising numbers from IDEAS, which is the largest bibliographic database dedicated to economics, with India being listed under the top 50 regions in the world for economics research output. Other numbers from Ray et al. Indicate that economics is among the most prolific social sciences in India. But despite this, we see that there are several issues that exist in the Indian social science fora, and a study from Thorat and Verma gives us some key takeaways in this regard. In particular, we want to emphasize from their study that there is no single unified social science policy, and that barriers and constraints ranging from lack of funding to inadequate research infrastructure pose severe challenges to the contributions that Indian social scientists can make. So a pressing question in this regard is, how have these challenges affected gender and caste representation in India? So let us take a look at gender. Intuitively, we see that women in economics, as elsewhere, face familiar barriers when it comes to pursuing economics as a profession in our country, from patriarchal gender norms, such as the responsibilities that come with caregiving to the household, to a sheer absence of strong mentoring institutions. Women face a plethora of societal, economic, and cultural obstacles that hold them back from quality education and opportunities. Dongre et al., a source that you will see much of in this presentation, shows us that through their paper, across 120 academic institutions and 1,300 conference papers, there is a very low representation of females in economic research. So I'll go into detail regarding this particular data set shortly. So let us now turn to look at what caste-based representation looks like in India. So as we all know, the caste system is a form of social stratification that divides Hindus into four categories, which are then preserved through hereditary transmission and endogamy. So despite the constitutional abolition of the caste system in 1950, the practice of social exclusion, untouchability, and so on remains very prevalent in modern day India. And that potentially manifests in a lack of representation of oppressed caste students and faculty in academia. So although affirmative action policies such as the reservation system have been put in place, recent data on hiring numbers tells us the real story. So out of the 6,043 faculty members at 23 Indian Institute of Technologies, only 149 are from the scheduled castes, 21 from the scheduled tribes, and which therefore translate into only about 2.8% of the faculty body. So similarly, across the IIMs, or the Indian Institute of Managements, only 11 faculty members belong to these categories. So clearly, these are troubling numbers. So it is imperative that in this context, we understand that the dearth of support systems and role models are clear factors resulting in such low numbers. With a lack of faculty members belonging to these communities, students from oppressed castes and tribes more often than not find it very difficult to pursue the social sciences and therefore economics by extension as a profession. So what we really want to understand is how bad is it in terms of also student representation. So returning to Dongre et al., and also from what you can see on my screen, figure 2, we see that women's representation in postgraduate economic education has definitely improved over the years. But as recent as 2018, we can see a dip in representation, which show numbers that are very close to figures from 2011. So when looking at caste, as of 2018-2019, SC students constitute 19.9% of students enrolled in higher educational institutions. Thankfully, this number has now doubled over the last decade. Turning to faculty member representation once more, Dongre et al. Find that 28.5% of faculty members from top economic institutions in India are women, with the highest share at the associate level and the lowest at the position of full professor. So unfortunately, when we are doing our research, we realized that there isn't much publicly available data on faculty-wise caste-based representation. But the All India Survey on Higher Education shows us that across an estimated about 14 lakh teachers, not specific to economics, 42.2% are women. For every 100 male teachers in the SC category, 57 are female. And in the case of both ST and OBC, this ratio stands at 68 females per 100 males. So it goes to show us that gender representation within oppressed castes is an important measure to take into consideration. From Malghan and Joshi in 2017, we can see that even in prestigious institutes such as the IIMs, out of 512 faculty members, only 2 were from the scheduled castes, 13 were from other backward castes, and there were none from the scheduled tribe category. Finally, another data set from the MHRD shows us that out of the 19 sample institutes that were considered in their pilot survey, 6 did not even report a single faculty member from the ST community. Unfortunately, due to the lack of publicly available data, what we present here is only a snapshot of what representation looks like within Indian educational institutions. Despite this, even a glimpse of the situation gives us startling results. So how do we tackle this? What are the implications of this data, and what does it mean for future policy? So we have Jasmine giving us some answers.
Thank you, Meher. I hope I'm audible. We come to the final part of the presentation, which is discovering how we can use our report to recommend policies that are sustainable and can also ensure enhanced representation of students and researchers from marginalized communities. Now, one of the key provisions that are already in place, which is meant to enhance representation and also to address caste-based discrimination in educational institutions, is the establishment of a UGC-mandated SC/ST cell in all educational institutions. Further, there is a Thorat committee, which was set up in 2007 following widespread discrimination against students coming from oppressed caste. And the Thorat committee recommended that there be a post-based roster system of reservation for senior residents and faculty appointments. In recent times, there has also been considerable steps taken up for establishing gender cells in educational institutions, but these largely deal with issues of workplace sexual harassment. Now, the extent of intellectual and material deprivation that exists in academic institutions in the global south, it has a lot of impact on the lives of marginalized communities in the global south. And these consequences often are more impactful on the lives of people living in intersections like, say, Bahujan women. And in the name of upholding certain rules and regulations, these educational institutions and academic spaces often overlook the problems of marginalized students. And which is why one of the most important aspects of bridging this gap essentially comes from the simple fact of acknowledging the existence of a problem. So, our first policy recommendation is to acknowledge the existence of the issue at hand. Acknowledging the caste system, in spite of the provisions that are already existing, it sort of helps you, and it's essentially the first step in reforming the current landscape. In India, a major chunk of the responsibility lies on elite higher education institutions have to acknowledge that they lack a formally stated policy on diversity and representation. Now, in one of the top women's colleges in Delhi University, there is absolutely no scheduled tribe women in the economics department. Similar is the case for Dalit, Bahujan, and Muslim women who are not adequately represented in these institutions, where most of them are first generation learners. Now, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of students from oppressed communities that speak about the kind of alienation and the kind of faculty apathy that they face in these spaces. And further, the current rules and regulations of these institutions sort of limit the goals of these students to the singular objective of passing or failing the examinations. And those marginalized students who, in spite of their struggles, continue to prove their caliber in other areas of the discipline, are simply dubbed as the non-meritorious and rejected by these institutions. By the same system that has been incessantly rewarding privileges to other people. Now, despite all of these concerns, these very same institutions continue to hold the top positions in almost all of the rankings, which is again a proof of the fact that marginalized students, their alienation, their problems, and their issues do not feature anywhere in mainstream ideas and conceptions of excellence and merit. Now, coming to the faculty representation, in response to the lack of faculty diversity, often universities say that they're not able to find suitable candidates. Worse, sometimes they attribute the deteriorating quality of their teaching to SC, ST, and OBC faculty who have availed reservation. And to make matters worse, there's also a lot of implicit discrimination and stereotypes that exist against oppressed castes. Bahujan students are often stereotyped as being less meritorious for exercising their constitutional rights, reservations. So the simple act of acknowledging the existence of the issue goes a long way into ensuring that people acknowledge the problem and start taking initiatives towards representation. The second most important policy recommendation is to ensure targeted recruitment of faculty and students coming from marginalized communities in academic spaces. The solutions can be twofold. the immediate solution includes hiring and filling all of the vacant positions, which are reserved for Bahujan and women. The reserved positions for women and Bahujans should be filled immediately, as mandated by the Government of India. These should also be accompanied by time-bound assessments of the status of the recruitments and promotions across universities, and also a public disclosure of the same. The third policy recommendation that we have is to establish networks of mentoring and curricular support. Because one of the major barriers to adequate representation of marginalized communities and women has to do with the fact that a robust mentoring network, which can provide context-specific advice and help them tackle systemic bias, is absolutely absent in a lot of academic spaces. Now, we know that data shows that women's representation drops drastically between getting a PhD and entering faculty position. And a lot of this has to do with the perception, or rather the assumption, that economics requires quantitative rigor, which is innately absent in Bahujans or women. So appropriate mentoring from current economists should be an institutional initiative, and a lot of networks are already taking this up, and this should be continued. The final recommendation that we have to put forth is to form community support networks and collectives. Mobilization of students belonging to marginalized communities and their consolidation into support groups and collectives can go a long way into ensuring that they have agency and assertion. These collectives can provide a platform for students to find solidarity in each other, to articulate and develop each other's ideas, and also to mentor each other. And such collectives also are sustainable and independent networks of support which exist within these communities. Now, the key to understanding all of the above mentioned recommendations is the very simple fact that representation matters, be it in the form of faculty or support groups or fellow students and academicians. Representation is key to ensuring progress. Now, what are the key challenges going forward? The paper by Dongre et al. Suggests that there's a lot to tackle in terms of the barriers to entry for female economy. And although it does not discuss in length probably people living in institutions in India must take notice of the absence or the disproportionate representation of these groups, or rather the underrepresentation of these groups in academia. Now, some of the immediate initiatives that can be taken on go beyond just hiring of people. And one of them can be establishing a specific funding for research, which is earmarked for female or marginalized group researchers. Now, if our end goal is to ensure that economics has more representation or is more plural in terms of the voices, we must first and foremost acknowledge the fact that a lot of sections of the society do not feature anywhere in the discipline. The next step will be to build a concrete network and incorporate policy changes that can enhance representation in academic institutions. And finally, we have to put in place a set of sustainable policies that can ensure that the groups and their intersections have a sort of incentive to remain in economics and keep contributing to Indian economics, and moreover, use economics as a tool for empowering themselves and their communities. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. Thanks so much, Mihir, for that, for presenting the data as well as sort of very important policy implications that are arising out of this work. So I think Aditi is a little predisposed at the moment. I think she has sort of bad network. So I'm just going to try and anchor this as we go along. Okay, good. So I think what we'll do is go to Dr. Malghan and perhaps get his thoughts on some of these issues. And we have a few questions as discussion points that we put together for you to discuss. So I'm just going to sort of bring them forward, and then maybe you can just sort of address them and generally share your thoughts about the policy brief as well. So I guess some of the questions that we have put down are, how do the mainstream undercurrents of the discipline of economics affect the issue of diversity and representation? And what are the so-called limitations of, what are the key limitations of the so-called value-neutral scientific method that we use in economics? And how is social reality reproduced and reflected in these research outputs? In fact, I think there's a question also that we got in the Q&A that's very similar to this. Any thoughts would be valuable.
Thank you very much. Thanks for doing everything that you're doing. This is clearly an important problem, and it's really heartening to see young people actually taking it head on. So first of all, I'm really grateful to Bahujan Economics and Ari and everybody else that's actually working on this issue. So thank you. I must begin with an admission. When I was first invited to join this panel, I was very hesitant because I'm not a credentialed economist. I'm a mere chemical engineer. My PhD is in chemical engineering, and I happen to moonlight in some of these areas. So you will have to bear with me if I trample on disciplinary spaces, right? Okay, one of the things that really struck me and what was coming through, I mean, especially as Jasmine was trying to work through what must be done and what needs to be done, was the following. We often spend a lot of time talking about this problem in the language of diversity, inclusion, etc. Right? I mean, essentially using the language from North America or sometimes even in Europe, but largely the North American framework. And it's important to recognize how the problem in India is fundamentally different. Right? I mean, structurally different from these sorts of issues that come up in North America. To begin with, we are not talking really here about minority representation or minority inclusion. Right? I mean, the problem that Indian institutions have long refused to grapple with is really one of majority exclusion. Right? I mean, that's why you have Bahujan economics, right? I mean, essentially the exclusion of a very, very wide swathe of Indian population. I mean, it is nobody's case that every single institution should mirror the overall population demography. Nobody is making that case. But the current snapshot, I mean, really should. I mean, as you presented numbers from a number of studies, actually, if you dig behind those numbers, and I can speak with some confidence, certainly on IIMs and IITs. I've been working on these questions within these elite institutions for a few years now. At IIMs, for example, if you looked at the faculty composition, and I mean, as you rightly pointed out, we don't have caste data. I mean, what we have is census category information obtained through RTI, but it is possible, I mean, through things like name matching algorithms, etc. So probabilistically, some of us estimate that, I mean, even at the upper bound, no more than 11% of IIM faculty members, right, are not drawn from two specific jatis, let alone broad upper caste category, which is to say that at least 88, 89% of IIM faculty members are drawn from just two castes. No prizes for guessing what those caste groups are. Brahmins and Kayas represent about 88, 89% of IIM faculty members, and you juxtapose that against their share in the overall Indian demography, and you begin to recognize that the problem that we have in Indian institutions is really akin to what institutions in South Africa were dealing with. Indeed, the problem of representation in elite Indian institutions like IIMs, IITs, public institutions. I can say this with some authority. The representation problem within IIMs today in 2021 is actually worse than University of Cape Town in 1995. Right? I mean, as South African institutions were emerging from the shadows of apartheid, and I mean, these were traditionally white-only institutions. I mean, it's just an empirical fact that South African institutions in 10 short years made more progress than Indian institutions have been able to over multiple decades. And I mean, I think it's useful to learn from, I mean, if you're looking to build networks, learn from other examples, I'd suggest Indian institutions can work fruitfully with places like South Africa, where I mean, they are faced with somewhat of a similar problem, right? I mean, blacks and whites have lived in their case, it was de jure segregation, but in the Indian case, it's de facto segregation. I mean, some of the work that I've been involved with, very detailed intra-village segregation. If you look at Indian villages today, segregation by caste, I mean, just in terms of who you're seeing, who you're meeting, who you're sharing your immediate neighborhood space with, is actually worse than Reconstruction era South in the American 19th century, right? So, I mean, what we have is a large problem of exclusion, right? And I sometimes wonder if by talking about the problem in the language of diversity, inclusion, etc., we unwittingly brush the major problem of exclusion under the carpet. So I think that was one of the things coming out of the presentation that all of you made, and I was very happy to actually see, I mean, especially the last bit of presentation from Jasmine, which alluded to actually recognizing that these are structures of exclusion that you're trying to deal with. All right. The second and third questions are hard. I mean, I'll make an attempt. I mean, are there undercurrents in economics? Well, as I said, I'm not an economist. I'm not a credentialed economist by any stretch, but I've been a keen observer of economists and economists and the economics profession. So I mean, I think I can claim to do this as an anthropologist of the economic profession, certainly as it is practiced in elite spaces around the world. I mean, if you see the sort of empirical turn in economics in the last 15, 20 years, especially the so-called credibility revolution. I mean, all of those things have moved the discipline in directions that have resulted in major new insights. I mean, there is no denying that some of these things have contributed immensely to our understanding of how societies work. But what this has also done is, in this world of monocausal explanations, data is certainly the new oil, right? I mean, your success, I mean, if you're looking at this problem, your success in the academic profession is very strongly now directly tied to the access to data sets that allow you to produce new insights, new knowledge. I mean, production of new knowledge, quote unquote, in economics is intimately tied to what your data sources are. So you want to focus on who has access to this database, who is producing this data, who is curating this data, so on and so forth. We are no longer really talking about simply accumulated social cultural capital at play. Right? I mean, that of course is important, as all of you have rightly pointed out. But we are talking about very direct input into production of knowledge. Right? I mean, if you don't have data, I mean, what are you working on? I mean, if you're doing empirical economics. So let me give you my pop anthropology. I mean, if you looked around, for example, at Indian origin tenured faculty members, recently tenured faculty members, what have you, in the last 15, 20 years at top departments in economics. This is not a problem confined to economics. I mean, economics, political science, sociology, even across the social sciences. My co-authors and I, on one of those days when our regressions were not converging, we spent time looking at, I mean, who are these people, who are the South Asians? I mean, this is not even an Indian problem. I mean, caste is a South Asian question. I mean, this is as much true with our neighbor to the west and south as it is in India. But if you looked at the social profile of, I mean, surely it's no surprise that just about every major Indian academic working in North America with immense power to set the agenda for the discipline is drawn from upper class, upper caste, urban background. But if you dig and scratch a little bit, it's not any upper class person that is dominating the social science academia from people from Indian origin backgrounds in North America. It's really people with very direct access to data, right? I mean, I'll let you do this exercise for yourself. I mean, take the top 15, 20 departments in North America, look for Indian origin economists, Indian origin political scientists, so many of them. I mean, this is obviously anecdotal evidence, so I'm not able to give you numbers, but anecdotally, so many of them actually even have a direct parent in the upper echelons of the Indian bureaucracy. Right, so I mean, there you go. I mean, that's where your administrative data, your ability to conduct experiments, what have you, is very intimately tied to these networks. Right, I mean, economics as a profession is now so data oriented that you now have a problem of data access in economics that is comparable to that in the life sciences. Right, I mean, in the life sciences, people have recognized for a very long time that diversity and your privileged networks are important, because that really determines what data is available to you to work on. Right, so that's one point that I wanted to.
Yeah. Sorry to step in there. So I realized that we had about like 12 to 15 minutes ahead. So maybe I could just get your quick thoughts on the last point, and then we can move to Dr. Sabrawal. Yeah.
Sure.
If you want to maybe say a couple of things about the last question.
I mean, okay. I can come back. So that.
Oh, sure. We'll come back to you.
I mean, I wanted to sort of hazard an answer to your second question. What are the key limitations of so-called value-neutral scientific method? When one of my central intellectual projects is I'm writing a global history of the idea of efficiency. So I was going to try and draw from that, but I mean, that can wait. I mean, we should listen to the other panelists. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Malhan. I now invite Dr. Nidhi Sabharwal. Aditi, if you want to step in anytime, feel free to do that. Yes. Okay. So thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Nidhi Sabharwal. We have a few sort of discussion areas similar as before, and I think about 12-15 minutes is what we have. So we can do it either that I sort of go through one question at a time, or I can just sort of present all the discussion points, and you can you can go uninterrupted, whichever way you prefer.
Perhaps I've prepared my
Sure.
sort of thing around those 3 questions based on the studies that I've done. So
okay, so I'll just maybe put out the questions for everyone, and then you can go ahead. So the discussion areas are sort of elaborating some of the key issues that minorities and sections on the margins of society face within academia, and what are some of the prejudices that feed into the discourse around affirmative action, reservation policies, especially in educational institutions, and what steps besides reservation can institutions take to create more inclusive environments.
Thank you. So first of all, many thanks for inviting me and providing me with this opportunity of interaction with all of you. I'm very, very happy to be here and also of the learning experience. So at the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education at NIEPA, we have recently completed a large-scale mixed method study on aspects of diversity and inclusion in higher education institutions that students and faculty members from the disadvantaged social groups face. And I'll base my comments on that study that we recently completed. These higher education institutions were located across 6 states, namely Bihar, Delhi, Maharashtra, Kerala, Karnataka, and Uttar Pradesh. So I will not really discuss too much on the student dimension of the challenges that students face, because given the limited amount of time that I will focus on the faculty members, because since that was the question that I was that I would reflect on, and the academia aspect of it. So to gain a deeper insight into the status of access of faculty members to professional development opportunities, and especially in terms of conference participation, we collected data from administrative records, and close to 200 interviews were conducted with faculty members to understand the nature of their challenges in gaining access to participate in professional development opportunities such as conferences, and those sorts of spaces are important to gain knowledge as well as to train oneself. And since the question that I was posed was that in relation to, what are the key issues that population groups from disadvantaged social groups are facing in the academia, in addition to underrepresentation that we have been discussing up till now. The study evidence shows that it points towards gender and caste related inequalities in access to professional development opportunities, such as in access to conferences. Participation in these collective gatherings, such as conferences, has been recommended by various higher education commissions and committees as an important element of professional development, career advancement, and for the academic growth of faculty members. It is widely acknowledged that participation helps in keeping pace with new developments in one's domains of study and teaching methods. And importantly, it lessens academic isolation by improving interactions and exchange of ideas amongst faculty members. So our study indicated that access for women and faculty members from the disadvantaged social groups to professional development opportunities across fields of study, such as social sciences, humanities, and STEM subjects, was lower than that enjoyed by men and from the upper caste social groups. The gap is notable in institutions offering STEM subjects vis-a-vis in those offering social science subjects, and women faculty members faced unfair access to opportunities to attend conferences. So for example, in one of the institutions that we studied, 13.5% of faculty members were women, but 7.1% conferences were attended by women. indicating a disproportionality between the representation as faculty members and opportunities to access conferences. Men academics, on the other hand, attend proportionately more conferences than women academics. Further, participation in international conferences for men was 13 times more than that of women in the institutions offering STEM subjects. And in the institutions offering social science subjects, opportunities to participate in international conferences for men were twice that of women, with the gap in the participation in conferences based on gender and caste persisting here as well across disciplines. Also importantly, participation in conferences by caste really follows what Dr. Ambedkar has said, graded pattern of inequalities in access to opportunities in the caste system. So with opportunities to attend conferences increasing with the increase in the caste status, and higher caste enjoying a greater likelihood of participation vis-a-vis those that are lower in the caste hierarchy. Now, I'll come to the second question in your what you had asked. What are the prejudices? So this is caste intersecting inequalities that I've talked about, gendered and caste. But what we found, what were those forms of social? Because we used a social exclusion lens to understand this relational aspects of conference participation. So we found that interviews with faculty members provided us with insights into common challenges that all faculty members faced, but importantly also group specific challenges that faculty members faced, faculty members from the socially excluded group faced, which posed a barrier in access to the conferences. So while common challenges really related to unsupportive institutional practices that posed for all faculty members, irrespective of their social background, on the other hand, the group-specific factors related to forms of social exclusion that impact faculty members from the socially excluded groups. So for example, at the institutional level, restriction in days to take academic leave to attend conferences, paucity of financial support, an absence of orientation program organized by the administration on academic potential and benefits of participation in conferences other than requirement for promotion, and a general workings of the academic hierarchy where senior members of staff, even without leadership roles, were seen to exercise surveillance over junior members of staff's early career academics, reflected limited encouragement from the part of the institution for professional development and academic growth. So unsupportive institutional practices towards participation for professional development negatively impacts all faculty members. It is irrespective of caste, gender, or other demographic factors. And while policies and management structures are put in place to ensure this standardization of operations, instrumental exclusion is also layered with relational exclusion to processes by which community belonging is established. And as such, any process of instrumental exclusion or inclusion is susceptible to relational inclusion or exclusion with regard to smoothing the way or creating obstacles. So women and marginalized groups may be accessing academic jobs, but they may be excluded from the dominant culture of the institution and thereby excluded from the social networks and sources of information. A lack of access to dominant culture within the institution means, in part, a lack of access to extra institutional spaces such as conferences, which in turn means that the benefits of conferences may be inaccessible both through lack of access to conferences and relational exclusion at conferences. So from and at knowledge production spaces. Our study found that being placed lower in the academic hierarchy contractual nature of employment, not knowing the regional language where the institution is located, and limited access to social network, jaan pehchan, marginalized women more than men, and faculty members from the socially excluded groups than the rest. So, for example, regarding the common issue experienced across participant groups that I just mentioned, which was related to the guidance and the provision of information on conferences and professional development that was mentioned as not being provided as part of institutional procedure. So that was something that was common to all and experienced by all. Here, informal networks, jaan pehchan, and social interactions, say over a cup of tea with administration during or after office hours, played a clear role, especially in case of women. Women past participants felt that such social interactions and informal social interactions would be frowned upon, and women's reputation would be at stake if they were to transgress the codes of sexual propriety by engaging in sociable activities with senior leaders who tended to be men. Hence, valuable social networking is restricted for women faculty members. Regarding caste-based exclusion, faculty members from the socially excluded groups such as the scheduled caste reflected on lobbying on the basis of caste to access professional development opportunities and caste-based biases of their upper caste head of the departments. So it should be noted, in fact, in terms of gender-specific factor, which were mentioned in conjunction with the women's access to conferences, for faculty members who were women, in addition to institutional barriers and exclusion from social interactions, patriarchal norms governing home spaces combined with similar institutional conditions to restrict access to conference participation. So family as an institution and workplace as an institutions intersected and restricted their access to professional development opportunities. This led to this kind of resulted in leading women unable to fully occupy an academic identity and instead splitting their identity between work and home duties. Like I said, this took the form, and it was mentioned and said also in your report, this took the form of women being burdened with care responsibility, household duties, restrictions from families to travel out of town, and lack of encouragement to attend conference, as participation was considered as an outing by family members rather than professional obligation. Now, what steps besides reservation can institution take to create more inclusive environment? And like you mentioned, while affirmative action policies have been in place for several decades in India to improve the representation of academics from socially excluded groups, we still find that there is underrepresentation. Empirical evidence from this study suggests that institutional barriers result in the unfair exclusion of faculty members from the socially excluded groups from participation in conferences. So those who are inside the institutions, that itself, there are barriers that they face when they are accessing to make their journey into their academic growth. So it is important that institutions engage in actions. Diversity does not appear naturally. It has to be achieved. Diversity requires acts of inclusion, and it requires actions from institutions to ensure equal and non-discriminatory access to opportunities such as these professional development opportunities. So for example, institutions can consider instating special support mechanism which track the participation of academic staff in conferences and other activities, and identify patterns in unequal participation which may reflect social exclusion in the institutional culture. Institutional committees could be founded along the lines of those already in place for the well-beings of students. The committees could provide an accountability structure for participation in activities which could be located outside the departmental structure. Of course, it should be borne in mind that any of these recommendations could be susceptible to the same issue of relational exclusion without explicit training and guidance regarding gendered and caste-based stereotypes and prejudice. It is very important that for instituting change, it is necessary that we have a holistic view of how hidden inequalities in the academic profession further perpetuates inequalities. And finally, it is important that institutions recognize their role as facilitators and not as gatekeepers that can potentially promote and not restrict the creation of open, diverse spaces of knowledge production and maintain high standards of research excellence across all faculty members. So I thought that would be my, and this is a paper that has already been published, and it's in Gender and Education Journal in the January 2020 issue. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for highlighting the role of networking and how important these networks become for especially women and marginalized communities. Coming to Dr. Prakash, one of, as pointed out by the speaker and also from our policy recommendation that we are making relates to creation of robust mentorship curriculum advisory group similar to the initiatives that you have taken, AMIE, Amy. So can you share your experience of what motivated you to do that, evidence that network effect are powerful, and anything that we should keep in mind while making this type of suggestion? And also, what kind of barriers do women in general face when it comes to employment opportunities? And what kind of things should women be looking at to make a career in economics academia be aware of?
So thank you so much, organizers. I know there are many, but Rethinking Economics, Bahujan Economics, and did I miss anyone?
Mang Prayogshala.
Yes, Mang Prayogshala, Anirudh, Aditi, everyone. So these are like really difficult questions and like many issues that has been raised on this forum, including the report. I would love to read that report because it seems something that I should absolutely read carefully. And all the discussions has been so far very enriching. So I'm going to like take a slightly different approach and talk about something which has a lot of personal motivation rather than institutional, because many things emerge out of your personal challenges or experiences that you have faced. So I'm going to talk about something that I have recently formally started, and I will touch on the different barriers that women face in economics and in general academia, but that not too very factual. I'm going to like that part is going to not be very factual, but based on just my own experiences. So I have slides. Let me see if I can, how do you, okay. So is this slide visible to everyone? Okay, so this is a, okay, let me just talk a bit about the personal journey, mentoring and inclusion. I'm definitely like not like, you know, Nidhi and Deepak, they all have been like, you know, their experiences are probably more relevant and important for the Indian context. So my context is probably like this 1 or 2 slides, but I have been definitely interacting with various universities. I have authors in India, so I know a bit, but not a lot. I did my undergrad at Shivaji College, which is in Delhi University. What I have heard is it's very hard to get admission these days, but during my time, you could get admitted with 67, 68%. And I mostly experienced lots of failures when I was in my undergrad. But that was my fault. I failed my first year, got 41% when I attempted my first year again. I moved to North Campus, and there was a concept at that time called taking sitting, means like you can attend classes at a different college. Made new friends, and I would emphasize, I think some of the speakers and the organizers were talking about the peer effects. I think that's very relevant. New friends who used to work very hard. I think what the biggest realization was, oh, I need to work hard. I can't just spend 1 month and pass my undergrad. I worked hard. Those things did not translate into test score, which is again like an area of research that I myself I have worked on. So, but more importantly, continue to work hard. And what I got was like the minimum threshold that you are required to be eligible for many entrance exams. I think this is something that I recommend to everyone, which is have plans. Concrete plans, because once you have a plan, you can come up with various ladders, like how do you reach that goal. This is something that I practice with my PhD students, my undergrad, and my mentees. So I have these plans, and somehow plan one worked, but it wasn't without challenges. When I was applying for my PhD application, almost everybody thought it was a very crazy idea, because I was one of those extremely academically weak student in terms of transcript or GPA. There are many things when people tell you, and I don't know what to recommend to anyone who goes through this, but have a good filter. Try to ignore those things. When people tell you in front of your classmates that you cannot do this because you suck or you're terrible. So the way I approached was, it actually to me had a very different impact. It made me much more stronger. And something that I try to practice is, you cannot control other behaviors, but you do have control over your own. So at least like the biggest lesson was, I'm not going to behave this way, and I'm not going to judge anyone's ability. So I went to University of Houston. This is in Texas, and I did get an opportunity to work with one of a really extremely tough but a nice advisor. And I'm quite indebted to her for many things. So now, mentoring and inclusion, like this is something that I have been doing for several years. Even as a PhD student, I had many students from Delhi School who reached out to me, and I would talk to them, tell them where they should be applying, what they should be doing. Of course, I didn't have much experience back then. But there are simple things most can do, and I actually encourage each one of you who have at least experience, or who have the ability to do this. Like, for example, when student reaches out to you, go over the SOP, statement of purpose, go over their resume, tell them what they could add, what they are missing, talk about universities he or she is applying. This is something that has come up many times. Many students send emails to universities or professors, and it might not, they might not use the right set of word terms, and it's not as effective. So what I have tried to do, and it might be very intrusive, but this is for the benefit of the students, I typically tell them that, show me your email, like show me what you're writing, and to give them edit a bit, and eventually they figure it out. And overall, these small things are actually quite useful and very effective in drawing someone's attention. And I try to call it as soft skills. So we all should try to do this in ways possible, lead by example. I think this in itself improves inclusion, as these are mostly sought by non-elite students who I think will do well regardless. So as a faculty member or as an academic, I think we all can do a bit more. And I'm going to give you some specific example and talk to you about my initiative. I met a student at a conference. Student contacted me to get help in the PhD application. So the student did take initiative. So I encourage each one of you that if you meet somebody, if you get a good vibe, reach out to them, send them emails, follow up. I went over the student's SOP, made edits. The student asked me to read the paper, which I did, and I really liked. I felt it was a very smart move. It never seemed that the student was trying to be opportunist, because it seemed like too genuine. And I was really impressed with the paper and overall portfolio. And I said that, well, now I know your paper, I know what you're doing, what your motivation. I'm happy to kind of write you a short letter. And it sort of like helped quite a bit, because the student did not come from any the traditionally elite background. I must add, and I must emphasize, that it takes lots of time and effort. It really takes a lot of time, and this is not something that is rewarded in the profession, because in the profession, in at least I can talk about the US institution, there's no reward for these things. I mean, yes, it is all intrinsic, but it does, if you help out, I think you feel good about it. So it has to be more personal than nothing extrinsic in some sense. It helps improve inclusion, because these are also sought by people who don't have these opportunities or luxuries. So this is something I have been, Aditi, who is here, who has been helping us in many projects. She might give you a better sense about some of these experiences, which are very useful when you apply for PhD admissions. So this formally started when I mean, you can't hire a research assistant or pre-docs. That's a fancy term that has been recently used if you don't have money. So when I started receiving grants, I started hiring RAs and pre-docs. So what should the hiring process be, and who should you hire? And I think it's a fairly important question. So I would definitely emphasize that, look, as a researcher, you cannot compromise on the quality. You need RAs and pre-doc of who possess certain traits, or who possess certain qualities or technical skills, non-technical skills, and we cannot blame them for those requirements. So conditional on, say, few people meeting those requirements, I think one can do a bit more. So my approach has been to do kind of very open search, and actually not pay attention to the GPA. Like, that's the MA bachelor's marks. I really never look at it. I mean, of course, it does come and bite the students when they apply for PhD, but as far as I'm concerned, it has, I pay zero attention to that. So almost all my RAs and pre-docs have been students who are very driven, hardworking, very eager to learn. But I wouldn't say like the typical stars in terms of GPA. So, and in the very beginning, as a researcher, when you reach out or when you start hiring RAs, these stars typically don't even apply, because you're not like a fancy professor. But they do now, because a lot of these students also know that some of these non-fancy professors also have time. And hiring and placing the stars are very easy, right? Because they have a very good transcript. And I can tell you, it's very tempting to hire them, because and one should not blame the employer, but in my experience, there are many amazing students who are eager to learn, who are not the star. And if you have an opportunity, then take the time to select them and invest in them. And not focusing on GPA in itself has, as I said, not strictly defined inclusion. You are giving opportunities to a student who would not be attractive to many PIs or researchers. This is, again, very, very time consuming. I cannot tell you how time consuming this is. It's not a part of a 10-year decision, which is a term used in the US when assistant professors become permanent. Try to find time to help your RAs, help them grow intellectually, not just the RA work, but actually help them beyond that by helping them achieve their goals. Always believe in their ability, shape them, kind of be encouraging, share some of the tricks of the trade. And majority of my RAs and pre-docs, as I said, are not elite, but I have been able to place them in, like I would say, pretty solid PhD programs. I have 16 RAs and mentees so far, 9 female and 7 male, kind of tells you what I have done. And some of these experiences has led to this new organization that I have co-founded, which is called Association for Mentoring and Inclusion in Economics. This is co-founded with another researcher. She's a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we are planning to do, but the idea is to kind of identify some of the gaps and try to address this in the economics profession. I'm going to be upfront and say that, look, the challenges that people face in different countries, I'm not aware of these challenges. So it's very hard for me to draw or say anything what's relevant in different country. What I understand the most is about the challenges which researchers face in the US, and I think I'm going to stick to that because that's what I know the most. But I'm happy, if these things are useful in any different in a different context, different country, I'm happy to talk to anyone who is interested in this. So as I said, there's a personal motivation behind this. PhD student from disadvantaged groups, including students who do PhD from mid to low ranked universities, they lack certain advantages. I don't have data to support this, but we are doing a survey soon. The type of feedbacks they get on early draft, finished papers, access to data, Deepak talked about it, access to network, both Deepak and Nidhi talked about some of these things, or well-connected faculty members, access to information. So for example, I recently got to know that many economists resubmit their papers to the same journal even after getting rejected. This is not something that I knew. Access to funds, many organizations restrict funding to people who are the members, and these members are typically who come from certain background. Letter of recommendations from outside, refereeing experience. So these are PhD students or scholars who are an academic who don't get to referee papers, and these are the gaps which I think organization can address. So one of the motivation was, this has been talked about quite a bit in economics, that how there exists large variation in outcomes. So treatment during presentations, publishing, promotion, conferences, depends on race, gender, name of the institution. And we think that these can be improved via collaborations among junior scholars across universities, opportunities to present and receive kind of timely feedback and at the right stage, providing these workshop and seminar opportunities for junior scholars. And I would say mentorship becomes a pretty big part of it. So what we want to do is we want to address some of these gaps in the profession, economics profession, for PhD student, especially from underrepresented minorities, LGBTQ, and especially first generation college and international student. When I say international student, this definitely includes a lot of students who I have been helping formally and informally who are based in India, provide opportunities to present work, receive high quality feedback, mentoring. But we do want to stick to something that is demand driven, which is we want to identify the gaps through a survey, which we are going to launch very soon. So we want to take a bit of a scientific approach, which I think is really useful as we move forward. So I'm going to, in the interest, yeah.
Sorry, Nishith. I put down a link to the Amy homepage. I just thought that maybe we'd quickly get into some questions. Do you have any sort of any maybe concluding thoughts and wrap up in a minute or so?
So what part do you want me to wrap on?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just the bit on, since you've set up this mentorship network, and sort of is there anything in particular that maybe folks from India should be aware of in particular before approaching you, or sort of being part of AMI or something like that?
So I think let me then emphasize this one part, which is mentorship, which has come up quite a bit. So think about creating a robust feedback mechanism between a mentor and mentee, and you need to pay very close attention to who these mentors are. So in our experience, a lot of people come and say, that we want to do mentorship, but it's not always obvious that. Any organization which wants to take up some of these issues should really pay attention to the selection of the mentors. Faculty student mentorship, any organization should try to facilitate this, create some kind of a buddy system for PhD student where a senior student can help the junior students. We do want these mentors to be the future letter writers, because I think that's very important when it comes to PhD admissions and also otherwise. And create some kind of both professional and social support system, which I realize that in academics, it's a very lonely place. You're pretty much on your own. And So I'll stop to the and talk a little bit about the inclusion. It's very important. Inclusion can have very different meaning for different people, but I feel that the most important is everyone should feel valued, respected, treated equally. And Aditi and Anirudh, you both talked about challenges faced by women who want to pursue. Look, academics, at least the academics that I know, it's fairly difficult and fairly challenging in the early stages. And so for example, university come up with policies like, oh, once you have a child, we are going to give you this 1 year of tenure extension. This applies to both parents, father and the whoever is in the academic. And what I realized that, it's a good thing, but at the same time, if let's say I'm giving you an opposite example, that as a father, when you get an extension, it's not always exactly what the policy intends to do, because then there are like questions, oh, you got a 1 year leave. Now, what more work have you done? That's not what the policy intended, right? But your colleagues judge you that, oh, you have a 1 year leave. And it's the same applies for the mother. Same thing during COVID, many universities have extended the tenure clock. And I think what's more important is how do your colleagues judge you when it comes to this? So I would say the first 4 to 5 years are very, very important, very tough. I don't know what are the solutions, but clearly one thing that I've realized is just be encouraging, and listening in itself helps quite a bit, because many female students, many female faculty members, my experience, because I also interact with them due to this mentorship, the discouragement is very high. When you say something negative, discouraging, it really impacts them badly. So creating a platform where people can express and kind of vent out, I have felt that it's quite useful. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you. Sorry.
No worries. Thanks so much, Nishith. I think super sort of insightful stuff on networks and mentoring, and given that it was like a major recommendation from the report, I think that's pretty good. So I'm going to go into the questions. I mean, I think Aditi is away, but I will just sort of, take the most upvoted questions, but in case you guys have more questions, feel free to put them down. And for the panelists, if anybody in particular, I mean, none of these are sort of targeted towards any specific panelist. So if anybody wants to step in and sort of think that they have something to contribute there, please go for it. So we have a question from Afreen. So will it be fallacious to ignore linguistic hegemony, especially when it is tied to caste and class exclusion? There could be a need to locate provision of writing as well as speaking aids. And she also had sort of a thought on locating ableism in education as well. So any of the panel, Dr. Nidhi, Dr. Prakash, Dr. Malghan, if any of you guys have thoughts.
So I can attempt in the context of because I think it's a very important question, and especially in terms of medium of instruction as well, that and connected with education and higher education, especially from school to higher education. So what our study found that, so just in the context, just let me place the issue in the context of higher education development and the expansion of higher education, massification of higher education, and diversification of higher education in terms of diverse student body. It has expanded very fast, and it has emerged as the second largest higher education system in the world. It is the second largest higher education. We have the enrollment in higher education in the country has experienced increase from 9.95 million students in 2002 to 37.4 million students in 2019. So, and it crossed this 10% mark in this 21st century. So from elite to massification of higher education. In that context, while expanding higher education is obviously more inclusive, in the sense there is more inclusion, there are more higher education seats and enrollment than the elite higher education system, because previously the HIS system was focusing on quality while expansion was sort of restricted. But there was a change in the development strategy of higher education, which was influenced by policies related to structural adjustment programs initiated in the 1980s, which favored market-friendly reform. And this will answer will give, not answer, but give some direction of why there are underrepresentation of students or student population in high value subjects and elite institutions. So there were market-friendly reforms, reduction in subsidies in education, and diversion of resources from higher to primary level education. Now, the reforms also involved reorientation of the role of state from a controller of private sector to its facilitator by reforming the regulations. The reforms in regulations, say for privatization, involve removing obstacles in competition, innovation, and growth, and setting of quality regulations based on the rule of law, transparencies, and accountability. So it was meant to develop the institutional system which served social objectives. For example, now policies of liberalization and development of higher education sector, this is important to note, and this gives the broader framework where higher education development is happening, is that it involved privatization of public institutions. So we have self-financing courses in public colleges, privatization of public colleges, and promotion of private institution. So while we have a larger number of students coming into higher education system, and affirmative action policies have in fact can are one of the important mechanisms of those acts of inclusion to ensure diversity in student composition. These gains actually have been overshadowed by new forms of inequalities in access to higher education and progression of disadvantaged students through it. So our studies show, coming back to the medium of instruction, our studies show that these kind of inequalities take the form of students from the disadvantaged groups overrepresented in state universities and government colleges, which are really serving the local student body. That those students are placed, the students are placed in the intersection of not only caste and gender, like someone would say, they are placed also in intersection of their prior educational experiences and prior educational pathways. And those educational pathways also is connected with the medium of instruction that has been followed in school. The data shows that most of the students who are from the disadvantaged groups attend government schools, and not only not Navodaya Vidyalayas or those following CBSE syllabus, but state syllabus where language and medium of instruction is in that regional language. So the transition to higher education institutions, where the medium of instruction is largely English, and in economics as well, the medium of instruction is largely English, that becomes an important really an important barrier. And it is important that institutional action is geared towards providing supportive student support measures to ensuring their academic success. And that's where equity, the process of equity, has to be institutionalized.
Thanks. I mean, I think that was super insightful. Anybody else have anything to add on that? Anything on language and sort of any stuff there? Okay, well, I mean, if there is something you can always chime in. There's another sort of interesting question here, which I think we briefly alluded to in the report itself as well. But Ria asked, so there's a low involvement of people from the Bahujan community in the field of economics, but there's been considerable research in caste-based discrimination and caste-based inequality in the field of economics. So the question is, do you think the nature and implications of such research can change, or rather will change, if economics becomes a more diversified field?
Nishith, you should go for it. You're an economist, so.
I mean, diversification is important, and that's pretty much why most organizations strive for that. But at the same time, the way I feel is, no matter how diversified any organization becomes, there will be some group that's going to capture a lot of benefits. Like, I think part of it is like basic human nature. We create barriers, we create ways to differentiate. But as far as like more academic answer goes, I think diversity is just extremely important, not just in economics, but elsewhere. Clearly in economics, thanks to the reports that has come up, the AEA reports and what you guys have presented here, I think these data should really make us think how to diversify the profession. And a lot has to go early on rather than later on. I also feel like, I know in particular, like Anirudh and Aditi, the kind of work you are doing at an early stage, I think that's going to play more important role, because many times, I mean, we know India has various affirmative action policies. My entire dissertation was on India's affirmative action policies. And we know it's beneficial. Nobody's going to discount that it's not beneficial, it's needed. But it's also like, how do you implement it? Like, and how to kind of do it in true spirit is going to be quite relevant. So yeah, that's like the both the academic versus the non-academic answer. But I think things have to start much early on.
May I add something
Yes.
very quickly?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nishith. So, well, like Nishith, I've been involved with running a more institutionalized mentoring program for a few years now. Well, I think one of the things that has really struck me from that experience, and then it's something that this experience has taught me, is the following. In response to what I think is a really good question. To the extent that structures like caste are structures of oppression, right? I mean, so what you mean by marginalization is really saying, well, I mean, you've had a long history of oppression, exclusion, etc. To the extent that there is an oppressed, there is also an oppressor, right? I mean, essentially, I mean, there are two sides to the same coin. And in response to this question, I mean, I think anecdotally, at least, I think and I believe the kind of scholarship and research that can come out of people with experience of being oppressed is going to be different from somebody whose experience is really being in the oppressor group, as opposed to being in the oppressed group. And I think, I mean, I don't have enough data to show you that that is indeed the case, but anecdotally, I mean, I think we should expect economics or sociology or any of this to look very different if Bahujans studied and wrote about caste rather than Brahmins studying caste and writing about caste.
I think while I have you, I mean, I think that there's another interesting question here that we also, of course, highlight in our report, which I thought would be useful to pick up as maybe one of the last couple of questions that we have, since we're almost out of time. So there's a lack of data maintained by Indian institutions to this, and Dr. Sabharwal, if you have anything to add here, that would be great as well. But if we want to make this case, we know that through RTIs and things we can get this data. But if you want to make the case that this data should be available in the public, what kind of what kind of institutional sort of support would we need to make that happen? And is there a need to sort of undertake a new approach to measuring inequality as approach sensitive to the various axes of power relations? And I know that's a sort of lot to pile on. It might put you on the spot, but maybe maybe comment on the data part, since you've had a chance to work with some of that data as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can't really make this case unless you have the data. Right? I mean, even with my own work with Siddharth, who really has been at the forefront of filing these RTIs around the universities. I mean, what can we do to make this data more available, etc.? This really falls on people who are inside these institutions. So the larger structural problem is something what Nidhi really articulated well, right? When we are losing our public universities, and then that is the real elephant in the room. I mean unless there is a commitment to public universities as spaces for all sorts of things, I mean, a lot of this discussion is moot. So beyond that, I think one thing that can certainly help is if there are advocates working for data transparency from within. Right? I mean, at my own institution, I mean, it's not that I have access to all the data that I am sitting on. I mean, being on the inside, I mean, I still have to use RTI, but I mean, at least I know that this is some data that might be useful. So how do you get that out into the public domain? I mean, RTI is one tool, but all of this assumes that there are public institutions and that public institutions are going to thrive, so on and so forth. So undergirding all this is really the real crisis in the room is the slow withering away of public institutional spaces. So, I mean, this is a hard question. I don't really know if I have an answer.
No, I think that's fair. Anyone else have anything to add on that? Anything on data, perhaps?
Data is, we know, very relevant, because without data you can't make a credible case. And my experience with RTI is it's only helpful to some extent. Like when there are so many ways to decline the request that I don't know if maybe there should be a different way than RTI. Like, maybe institution can take a stand and kind of post these things. I don't know if they're allowed to. I don't know that answer. But definitely RTI is a painful way to do this.
So what is also important, and of course the West has and the US has been doing this. I don't know how we will, it's also about the intent, and also about how much do we also evaluate ourselves. So that itself is an important question, and we've been arguing for institutional research, higher education, not so we are all we have been educated through higher education, and we do research on different aspects of society, but we have to look inwards into higher education, and perhaps at the level of MPhil or PhD. Now MPhil may not be there, but PhD, we may want to take up topics that we could study, and then produce knowledge around it, generate knowledge around it.
Thanks. I think that's good. So maybe I will just cover one last question. I know that we're about 5 minutes over time, but maybe so this question is about reservation for women in higher educational institutions and whether you think that is really helpful. And I'm sort of going to pair it with, this other question about limited education proliferation in the primary schooling levels as well, which is, I think, a couple of the attendees were having a discussion on that as well. So maybe any of these two questions, if any of you have any thoughts on, one is reservation for women in higher educational institutions, and the second one is about whether the lack of representation that we see in these higher education institutions is perhaps coming from sort of more limited education proliferation at the primary level itself, which I think we spoke about a little bit, but yeah, any thoughts on any one of these two things, I guess. No worries. I mean, I think that, I would be, happy to hear if anybody has any experience or examples of even maybe where some policies of reservations or quotas in higher education institutions have been, perhaps we know from our report that they have these quotas, they have sort of in public universities, but very often, as we've seen, these quotas aren't actually filled from the data that we have, at least.
So Anirudh, like more as a research question, isn't there like some kind of a system when you apply for undergrad admission? There's like, I mean, I know I keep hearing from my friends at Delhi University, there are like few percentage that you can, there's like something few percentage below the cutoff, like there's something with
they make some concessions.
Yes,
yeah.
I was trying to figure out a way to say it. So I think that could be a good start, because I was giving a talk at Shivaji College, and one of the professor who taught me, she talked about this. So maybe that's like would be a starting point, because that would definitely fall under RTI, and I think that's an easy RTI to get. To look into it, to what extent it benefits as an organization. You can, I don't know if there are ways to raise funds, to survey. I mean, you have a setup, you have a research question, but what you want to add is beyond tracking these students, to go out and kind of reach out and survey them and ask them about, like, their future outcomes, like, or kind of the short to long run outcomes, who have benefited from this. I think there's a merit to this.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Anyone else have anything to add there, like on women and quotas in higher education, or anything, or even any sort of points that we might have missed out, given that we've kind of gone into lots of different territory here?
So I have worked with lots of female students, and I teach a class on gender inequality. I can tell you that each one of us, I mean, to the extent that the students, when they first see me in the class, like, wait a second, why is a male professor teaching a class on gender inequality? So I think we all have some responsibility that some of the challenges faced are very different. Take some time to understand where these challenges are coming from, because they are real, and figure out a way to help them in your professional and personal capacity, because not each one of us are kind of sitting in the parliament and changing laws, which would be terrific. So whatever we can do is in our personal and professional capacities to reach out and talk to them, offer them some help and guidance without judging them. I think just making them comfortable in itself. So for example, there are many, I'm working on something with, it's confidential, but the topic is mental health, right? Many universities are coming up with policies. But the fundamental problem is not just the policy. Like, you want people to reach out, you want people to talk about it. So you have to figure out what these barriers are. I think you guys kind of talked about what are the barriers to entry. So understand what are the barriers to even sharing the problems. So students should, from our side, we should understand what these barriers are and try to address those barriers, so that students don't feel that somebody is going to judge them, and be able to express themselves freely, so that you can at least in your personal and professional capacity help. Because I think, of course you can go after changing laws, but very few of us are in that position to change laws.
I just wanted to add one thing, just wanted to I was reminded of Dr. Ambedkar and what he said about representation and around the context of representation. It's representation of persons and not opinions. So that's what I wanted to just say.
Okay. So I mean, yeah, we're 10 minutes over time, so I'm not going to keep everyone waiting. Just in ways of sort of, you know, keeping in touch type of conversation. So we do have another session that's coming up on diversity and representation economics that looks at administrative and policy perspectives that perhaps takes this conversation a little bit forward. That's happening next week on 30th. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Deepak Malghan, Dr. Nidhi Sabharwal, Dr. Nishith Prakash. It's been amazing. It's been lovely to have you, and thank you so much for sharing all these amazing insights on diversity and representation. We hope we can keep in touch, and I think there are a lot of attendees who wanted to sort of get in touch with you, you know, otherwise either through Twitter or email. So perhaps they can do that as well.
Yeah, like feel free to kind of, you can advertise. I mean, my email ID, and anybody can reach out to me, and they can, if not, like, you know, Aditi can always put them in touch with me. And keep up the good work. And I would love to see the report if it's public. Thank you, Nidhi, and thank you, Deepak. Good to meet both of you.
Yeah, good to see all of you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the invitation, and good to meet all of you.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, bye.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.